Today, I have a very, very special guest with me, Vanessa Beeley. She's also one of the most respected journalists that I follow very closely because she has a very objective view about Syria, about the Middle East, and she doesn't take it from a personal view, but she takes it from a very professional, unbiased view. So that's very, very important to understand what's really going on in the region. So I really appreciate that you've allocated some time for me. Thank you very much, Vanessa. Hi.
Oh, Eli, thank you so much. I always enjoy talking to you anyway. And I would disagree slightly. I have a slightly biased view in the sense that I'm against neocolonialism,
Oh,
but
well,
I
so are
try
we.
to be as substantiated as possible in my views based on being on the ground in the region, which I think is, very important because a lot of people are analyzing, but from a distance,
Yeah.
based only on the information that's available to them, either in mainstream media or in independent media. And I think, we're kind of forgetting what journalism really means, actually. That's just my opinion, where fewer and fewer people are actually going to the places that they're talking about.
Or on social media.
Yes.
That's a very big problem.
That's a huge one, actually. Yeah.
Now, today, I invited you specifically to talk about what is currently in the news as if America has deserted the Kurds. But firstly, before I go into this topic, I want to very specifically differentiate between the Kurds and the terrorist organization, because this is very important. We have over 20 million Kurds living in Turkey, and they're not terrorists. But and there's also Kurds living in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, and they have no problem with the governments that they are living on or with Syria that they were living under. So, but we are basically talking about a terror organization that's been established since the 1980s by America, bred, fed, financed, and basically enabled them to spread all over the region to create this huge, large Israel project. So, first of all, when we're talking about the Kurds, we're not talking about the ethnic Kurds of the Syrians, of the citizens of the nations. We're talking about the terrorists that America is sponsoring. This is very, very important to differentiate because by America doing this purposely, they're literally trying to arm passive citizens against the governments that they are living under. So this is purposely trying to initiate civil unrest. So for me, to start this conversation, it's essential, absolutely essential that we differentiate this. So today, I want to talk with you in regards to, is America really deserting the terror organization that it's bred for so many years? And this project, this propaganda that's right now going around, how is it related to Al-Hor, Lebanon, Iraq, the presidential election, especially in Iraq, and also the uprisings in Iran? So the floor is yours.
Gosh, perhaps we can break it down a little bit.
I've done my part.
You've just basically asked me to speak for about an hour.
Well, I've got my
Okay,
tea.
first of all,
Go ahead.
First of all, yes, look, I want to address this issue of how basically sects and beliefs are being lumped together right now to create this kind of sectarian environment in the whole region. And when you're talking about Kurdish Contras or Kurdish separatists, as they're known in Iraq, for example, there are elements within the Kurdish communities who are, as you said, being weaponized, particularly by the United States, but very much in the background, Israel, as a forward settler movement to secure territory for Israel.
Yeah.
Why do I say that? Because it doesn't matter if you look at a map of Greater Israel, if you read the Clean Break Doctrine, if you look at the plans for David's corridor, so that would mean securing southern Syria, which is ongoing at the moment.
Yeah.
That's why they basically, in collaboration with Jolani, they fomented the massacres of the Druze communities in the south in order to create an environment which was so horrible, and it was horrible. I was in touch with friends of mine within the Druze community in Sweden and in the countryside, and they were describing the massacres to me by the tribal factions that had basically been stirred up into this sectarian anger by fake recordings that had been played out by Jolani's media institutions to try and create this hatred. And then, of course, the tribal factions were reinforced by ISIS elements that are under the command of the so-called, I'm not even going to call it, the so-called Takfiri forces that are called the Syrian army, but the majority, of course, are not Syrian. The majority are foreigners. The majority are terrorists, including ISIS and Al-Qaeda, that have been rebranded multiple times to try and distance them from their crimes in the past throughout the region. And so the idea was to create an environment in which the Druze would welcome Israel as a protector against the massacres by Jolani and his various factions, right? And then the idea will be to go from southern Syria to create the David corridor up the eastern border, so the border with Jordan and Iraq, into the northeast, under the control of the Kurds. I'll come back to that in a second, because you talked about the fact, is America really abandoning the SDF, or are we seeing the creation of another Druze environment where eventually the US and Israel will say, well, hold on, the Kurds are being slaughtered. We have to step in. We have to create a protected environment. We have to give the Kurds a safe, autonomous region, etc. This is where, personally, I think it's heading. And then the second element of that is to release all of the ISIS fighters. And I think, we're talking between family and fighters, I think we're talking over 100,000 in the 9 prisons in the northeast, the biggest being Al-Hol. But that's mostly families. But we also know that recently there have been reports of MI6 infiltrating the ISIS camps and radicalizing even the children through education. And just as an aside, so people understand that I do know the region, I have visited areas of the northeast after there was an agreement between the Kurds and the Syrian army. And I managed to enter some of the vacated American bases. Now, what was interesting is that it was almost like they were establishing schools for children within these bases, because we found a ton of children's books, children's school equipment, and so on. And this really puzzled me. But now I understand that the MI6 is infiltrating, they're radicalizing the children in these camps to create the future. To create the future ISIS forces, of course. And even prior to what's happening now, the US was constantly ferrying the ISIS fighters from the northeast into the central Syrian areas, the Badia, to conduct murderous operations against the Syrian army and their allies in that region. And actually, there are still a number of ISIS cells in central Syria that to some degree are affiliated with Jolani, and then at other times they are opposing him because, of course, he's now perceived to be pivoting towards Israel, towards the West, and even towards Russia, of course, which, again, we'll come back to that. And so there's basically 2 elements here. One is the question of, has the US and Israel really abandoned the Kurds? In my opinion, no, because I think ultimately what they've done, they needed to release the ISIS elements. Why? 1, because of the war against Iran. 2, because of the elections, as you mentioned, in Iraq. They want to be able to destabilize Iraq, one, so it can't come to the assistance of Iran if there is a major escalation regionally. And the resistance elements, the non-state actors and the state actors, because the popular mobilization forces, of course, are part of the Iraqi military, right? So they are actual state actors, have been very clear in saying if there is any attempt on the supreme leader's life or any attempt to do a President Maduro in Iran, then American bases will be targeted. So what's the best way for Americans to defend their bases without actually having to bring more soldiers, more troops into the area? Release ISIS. ISIS will do the job for them because they pay them to do this. I mean, it's a very well-known fact now that ISIS is another proxy of the United States and the entire Zionist bloc alliance, which includes Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar. Qatar, of course, has historically funded the Muslim Brotherhood factions, terrorist factions in Syria that are now, of course, incorporated to some degree. There are elements also of discord and chaos within Jolani's forces, where there's competing agendas, competing ideologies, and so on, which was inevitable. You know, to a degree, the US never, ever creates a scenario which is going to give stability. They create scenarios which are going to create chaos and instability and actual collective punishment of the people of that nation. The benefit of the very rich, the benefit of the Western investors in regime change. Remember in Iraq, the Paul Bremer project, which effectively put money in the pockets of Washington predator class that were coming in and so-called investing in the country. But of course, none of the investment was going to the people. That's exactly what is happening now in Syria with Tom Barrack and all of the so-called Gulf state investment. There isn't a penny coming into Syria. The majority,
like Venezuela,
sorry,
for example.
Exactly.
And they're depositing the oil that they steal.
The money in Qatar.
In Qatar.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Yes. And they're admitting it.
Yeah.
I mean, openly, Rubio said, we gave, what was it? Of the 5 million, let's say they gave 3 million to the Venezuelan government and put 2 million in a bank account. And that's basically going to sit there forever until the US needs it, right? So it is literally capitalist theft from a country that the global capitalists have just destroyed.
Yeah.
And so I think it's incredibly important when people look at isolated incidents, like, for example, now it does appear, and of course the Kurds are playing the violin, the Kurdish Contras are playing the violin and saying, we fought against ISIS all this time. And by the way, they kind of didn't really. There were elements of conflict between ISIS and the Kurds, but there were also many instances when ISIS backed off and let the Kurds in and vice versa. And there are documented evidence of intermarriage between SDF fighters and former wives of ISIS. There are elements of corruption, of course. Like at some points there were breakouts from the prison, and I wrote about this, really? Do they really just break out, or do they pay money to the SDF guard and they give them weapons and they go out? Because ultimately, it's the US that is maneuvering all of this, not the Kurds. I mean, to give an anecdotal example, when I went to the Northeast, and it was actually Manbij, which is more central, and I wanted to go to one of the US bases, and we were in a compound which was Kurdish and Syrian army. And we were sitting there for like 2-3 hours. The Kurds wouldn't give permission for us to go to the US base. And a Syrian army, I think he was, I don't know, he was an officer. He came to me, he said, I'll take you, but don't say anything. And we'll only have about 10 minutes before the Kurds will come and kick us out. So it's like, okay. So we drove to this base. We literally, and we had Syrian army escort. We drove to the base. He let me go all around the base. He said, you're going to have to be quick. 10 minutes later, the Kurds came over the hill. And the hour after we'd been there, and they kicked us out. And the hour after we'd left, they burned the whole base. So who gave them the instruction? Yeah, everything that was left, they burned. Because it's evidence. I had names, IDs of officers that were on the base. I had images of everything. I mean, they had stripped it bare anyway, but there was still an awful lot of information left there. And so clearly they received a phone call like, what the hell are you doing? You're letting a journalist into an American base? Are you crazy? And I mean, thank God for that Syrian army officer who decided, no, I've had enough of this. This is Syrian territory. I'm going to take you to the base. But they burned the whole thing after that. So that gives you an indication of to what extent the US is not only directing everything that happens in the Northeast, but they're also surveilling everything. The Kurds can't act without US discretion and instructions and support, and air support, of course.
Can they really go and burn an American base without permission, or without instruction?
Yeah, of course, exactly.
It's unbelievable. What's very interesting is you said you found some schools, and you found some school books. Were you able to were they in Kurdish or were they in Arabic?
No, they were in English. It was very odd. There were some in English, some in Arabic. And when I say school, they were like porter cabins, you know?
Yeah.
And then on the floor was strewn. But we also have to remember, of course, that the US Dine Corps, the contractors that were in Syria, have been accused multiple times of child trafficking.
Yeah.
So that also crossed my mind. Why are there so many children's toys and books and puzzles
learning
and
English.
This kind of thing?
Yeah. And learning English.
Yeah. Very odd.
Yeah. Well, I mean, nothing is done without a reason, but were you able to read what actually they were teaching the children?
No, they were pretty standard school books, to be honest. There wasn't anything suspicious. I mean, I'd have to go back through. I did take a lot of photos, obviously, and I took some of them with me, including the documentation. Actually, it was the Syrian army officer that had the names of the American soldiers that were there, and I did take photos of all of them. He couldn't let me take it because, of course, it was part of the the intelligence operation in the Northeast. No, I mean, they were fairly ordinary. I wouldn't say that they were like when Aleppo was liberated. We did find a huge number of Saudi books, very sort of extremist Wahhabi education, radicalization of children in East Aleppo. And of course, this is something which left a stain on Syrian society. And also, in my opinion, it explains why so many people, when Jolani was swept to victory, not through his own efforts, but through the efforts of particularly British intelligence, because if you watch the documentary, 2-hour-long documentary of Jolani's military operation, in my opinion, there are definitely British special forces actually participating in the attacks and certainly running the strategy. In a million years, I don't believe that Jolani or his cohorts were capable of figuring this plan out, if it really did happen like this. But it's the fact that because people ask me, well, okay, but why did people go out in the streets in celebration of Jolani? But if you think about it, Aleppo was liberated, the eastern areas, in 2016, Ghouta 2018. So kids who were, let's say, between 10 and 15 then are now young men.
Yeah.
So the radicalization procedure that went on during the occupation by the Takfiri forces of these suburbs and these areas, which would have been incredibly powerful. I was speaking to children in, for example, Eastern Aleppo. And they were telling me very matter of fact, we saw this guy crucified. We saw these other people buried underground with alive. They saw so much violence and ugliness. And then, of course, on top of that, there was no secular education anymore for 5 years. There was nothing but radicalization, indoctrination by the Wahhabi sheikhs and imams. The kids were telling me this. They said, no, we didn't go to school. We just went to the mosque.
I mean, it's Syria is such a sad place because it's just failed in front of our eyes, literally. And I mean, I went to Syria in 2023. I went to Damascus because I research a lot of. I was working a lot on the refugee crisis, and I wanted to see with my own eyes all the lies that was being fed to us. And I made a lot of videos from there, and I got severely attacked from the social media and people that were supporting, the change. But to see that country there as it was, and you've seen it in incredible more detail, to see it then and to understand it now, it's just so depressing. And we've literally lost not only a generation, we've lost a culture, we've lost a country, we've lost, we've lost the population. And what is also essential to, to confront is this Syria crisis is not only local. It's going to affect all the countries that have been involved in it. And really, these people are so radicalized because they've been left in the dark for so long that they have no idea or no concept of life apart from fighting. So, I mean, their ideal goal is to go to heaven or whatever, what they want to do. But I mean, their main trade is killing, and it's so depressing.
Yeah,
so depressing.
Absolutely. It's sectarian hatred. I mean, we're almost, I always say we're almost back in Kabbalah 2 territory, because we're heading back into this, GCC bloc, which of course is also supported by the Zionists because they perceive it as a way to destroy effectively all resistance. By saying that, of course, the Palestinian resistance is Sunni Muslim. And this is what I will also want to say, as you said about the Kurds. The Kurdish civilians, for example, who are being killed in Sheikh Maqsoud, or who were killed and displaced in Afrin, or who are now being massacred by Jolani's forces in the same horrible way that the Druze were, the Alawites were. Christians have basically been slowly marginalized and driven out of the country, which again is part of the US plan to reduce any kind of what is perceived as a buffer between a sectarian divide between Sunni and Shia and all the affiliated branches of Islam, right? So it's important for them to get rid of the Christians, because that basically then leaves the field open to be able to foment. Because if, for example, they're trying to say Hezbollah, for example, is killing all Sunnis, which is one of the underpinning narratives of the war. But the reality is, and I know this from being on the ground, Hezbollah was protecting majority Christians, whether it was in Malula or Al-Skalbiya or Mahade. I can promise you it was Hezbollah who clandestinely were the ones supporting the National Defense Fronts in all of those Christian towns. And we're protecting Sunni towns and villages inside Syria.
But the Christian situation is very special. Not a lot of people really concentrate on actually what happened to the Christians or what is happening to the Christians in Syria. But I do a lot of field work as well, just like you, because if you don't do field work, you have no idea what's really going on. And in one of my field trips to Hatay, I especially visited a town that was concentrated mainly from Syrian Christians coming to Turkey. And what really surprised me was they didn't have a lot of complaints about terror or being, it's as if they were, they were moved in a very orderly position. They didn't suffer anything. It was very strange to me. It was like they were, during the war or during this operation, the Timber Sycamore operation, they were literally protected and they were transferred. It was very, very strange how they were,
But these,
analyzing it.
these are Christians from the Idlib Christian towns, I'm guessing, majority.
I can't remember. I won't. I
I
don't want
would
to say
think
anything wrong.
so. I would
I'm
think
not.
so because the other Christian communities were very steadfast.
Mhm.
They didn't leave at all.
I'm not sure where they came from, but I mean, there were Christians from Syria because I specifically
Mm.
wanted to speak to them.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Mm.
I mean, their reaction, of course, they were very upset that, their country was, in such a situation, but uh, they were not traumatized as, for example, the Syrians, the Arabic Syrians
Yeah.
I met. So
That
it was very strange for me.
that wouldn't surprise me necessarily.
Mhm.
Because I would say Idlib because I'd visited almost every single Christian
Possible.
community in Syria and virtually lived with two of them during the worst of the attacks. And the majority were incredibly steadfast in the sense that they stayed and formed the National Defense Forces that defended their towns, which were besieged up until I think 2020 was when Kalat al-Madiq was finally liberated, which was 500 meters away from Skelbia. If you stood at the biggest restaurant in Skelbia, you could actually see the Nusra Front checkpoints, and they would on a daily basis send rockets into Skelbia. And I know because I spoke to refugees from Idlib, from the Christian towns in Idlib that came to Syria. So some probably went to Hatay, and some came back into Syria itself, to Latakia, to the coastal towns.
Possibly.
And they told me that, yes, Christians from the towns were to some degree given the option of leaving, while at the same time, of course,
So true.
Jolani
Yeah.
and the white helmets and so on were desecrating the churches. I mean, this is a well-known fact. They removed the crosses, they removed all of the icons and so on, and they were exported for sale. I mean, I think it's more than 1 million artifacts were lost from Syria during the war. And yes, you're absolutely right that for me, I see that even though they may have been calmly removed, it's still a removal of Christians
It's
from
displacement.
inside Syria. Yeah, and they're always given fast track, by the way, even if it's as you said, a relatively comfortable move into Hatay, or they're offered immediately visas to Canada, to Europe, and so on, because they're Christian. Why? Because they want to drain the area of Christians. I mean, if you look at Aleppo and even Damascus, it was the Christian zones that were being targeted on a daily basis by the mortars from the terrorist groups that were entrenched in the suburbs. It was all of the Christian areas, or in Aleppo, the Armenian Christian areas.
But what is interesting regarding the Christian, I mean, we're getting off the topic, but this is a very,
Yeah,
very special
sorry.
topic. No, no, but it's a very special topic that I think we have to talk about because it's what is very interesting for me is that I've never seen actually the Vatican or the Greek Orthodox Church protect the Christians of Syria, which is very interesting for me. I mean, the Christians in
Mm.
some way are protected, but no one is taking responsibility for them.
No, and to the same extent, though, I mean, like now, for example, the Christians are taking a very passive role, like a role of non-resistance, kind of acceptance of what is happening in Syria. And I understand it because they're a minority. What are they going to be able to do? But even church leaders are not supporting
Yes.
or condemning what Jolani is doing. So yeah, that is it's a big disappointment from, let's say, the Christian solidarity side with countries that have, I mean, where they were born, where they originate from.
Well,
And they're not, I mean, we never had a statement from, there was a Catholic priest, I won't give his name because obviously there are recriminations
yes.
now against anyone that stood with the government. But he was constantly writing to the Vatican and saying, please come out in support of Christianity in this region because it's under attack. There was never a statement condemning. They took the line They took the Israeli-US line on Syria very much. You must stop the killings. You know, it's all Assad's fault. It's all X, Y, Z.
I mean,
And I want to make like sorry, just quickly, a very strong point here. Like whatever opinion you have of President Assad, and honestly, in the last 5 years, we saw to a degree the disintegration of the government. But why? 14 years of war and internal destabilization. And then Trump in 2020, after the assassination of Haj Qasem Soleimani, who was tremendously pivotal to supporting particularly Christian communities in Syria. He actually trained the National Defense Forces in the Hama Christian communities. This is never talked about, right? But he was very, very, very instrumental in preparing the national defense for the Christian communities in northern Hama, and elsewhere in Syria, but particularly there. And then Trump, after the assassination of Soleimani, he brought in the Caesar sanctions, which actually stopped any country coming to the aid of Syria, even during the earthquake.
Yeah.
And the West was allowing aid into Turkey and into Idlib, but not into central Syria, where some of the worst catastrophe actually happened, in Aleppo, for example. And so gradually from about 2020, things started to unravel and disintegrate, and central government became dissipated into external, or rather kind of satellite mafia cartel power bases. And so it sort of became much, much weaker once Trump came into power, actually, the first time under the first Trump administration. And then, of course, the extra support for the Kurds, because the Kurds were perceived really as another important proxy for Pentagon. It meant that Pentagon didn't have to send boots on the ground in Syria because it could weaponize the Kurds. It could give them weapons. And I think basically what it did, it gave them an operation. It assessed the operation, and if the operation was successful, they gave them more weapons to do that. So it was like an incentivization scheme to get the Kurds on board and to basically fight for them in Syria. Right. But whatever opinion you have of President Assad, really, you're going to look at Syria now and tell me that Syria is better off? There's no law, there's no system, there's no money, there's no electricity. Forget about the propaganda that's being put out by state media, right? There's literally, people can't walk from their street to their work in case they're kidnapped. It doesn't matter who they are, actually, now. Because they released all the prisoners from all the prisons across Syria. And you can't tell me that all of those prisoners were innocent. 90% were Wahhabi or genuine criminals, rapists, and so on. And they're now wandering around in society perfectly happily and supported by Jolani.
But that's such a typical pattern of America. I mean, when they want to stabilize something, they immediately release the prisoners. I mean, this is such a typical prison. I mean, prisons for America are used for two reasons. One, to destabilize people and to train radicals. Actually, it's a training school.
Yeah.
Secondly, it's to, at the end of the day, it's to destabilize the society. They've done it in Afghanistan. They've done it everywhere, basically. But now, coming back to the Syrian army, I want to ask you two questions. Because you know the army as well.
Which Syrian army?
The real Syrian army. The real, with the Syrian people. Because right now, because there's not really a government, the Syrian people are not actually getting involved in what they call the Syrian army. So they need recruitments. In my opinion, part of the Al-Hol camp, releasement of the Al-Hol camp was to create recruitments for Jolani gangs, basically. I mean, for me, Jolani is a terrorist. His organization or whatever is also a terrorist organization, and I refuse to call him the president of Syria because firstly, he's not elected. Secondly, he's a terrorist.
Exactly.
I mean, and he's creating daily massacres. I mean, what they've done to Syria is really, it's no different from what Tony Blair or Bush did to Iraq. It's massacre on a mega scale. So what I want to
Mm.
know is, for the Syrian army, the real Syrian army, how many Christians and Kurdish Syrians that have nothing affiliated with the YPG were all also fighting with the government, with the state, against terrorism. This is so important because it's as if these people are all on the side of America, but it's not the case. It's not the case at all.
I think if we're talking about the real Syrian Arab army, which was Syrian and Arab and a cohesive army, as I always said, and I spent in total around 10 years on the 5 years living in Syria and 5 years reporting from inside Syria on really the majority of the kind of the front lines or the post frontline military areas. And the Syrian Arab Army, whether it was the Syrian Army or the National Defense Forces, which worked very much cohesively, it was not a sectarian army, it was a secular army. It was made up of every single faction and sect and community inside Syria. So whether they were Christians, whether they were Kurds, you're absolutely right. There were definitely Kurds from Sheikh Maqsoud. There were translators that were working within the army, translating into Russian or translating into English, it didn't matter. Who were Kurdish. There were Kurdish communities, relatively small ones, but in Damascus, who of course supported the Syrian government and the Syrian army. The narrative now, of course, is that all Alawites should die because Alawites were the majority that were oppressing every other, particularly Sunni Muslims inside Syria. But the Syrian army, and not only the Syrian army, the civil defense, the real Syria civil defense, was also made up of Druze and Christian and Sunni and Shia, all and Alawite, all working together. If you look at the intelligence, I've actually done a report on this. If you look at the intelligence and security and military institutions and the heads of those institutions, 98% are Sunni, not Alawite. The wife of the president was Sunni, right? So this entire narrative is just ridiculous. It's just a narrative that was amplified. Yeah, it was amplified by the West to kind of portray, and what it has actually done, criminally so. And no one is going to be held accountable for this. But who were the first minorities to be targeted and massacred? And that's still ongoing. Are the Alawites, whereas the majority of them were actually the poorest communities inside Syria. Why? Because, and I actually think personally, this was a mistake. They were literally, to a degree, marginalized by the government so that the government didn't look like it was supporting the Alawites more than any other community inside Syria. And so what ended up happening, they were actually largely marginalized, disenfranchised to a huge extent. They're some of the poorest communities, those that are being massacred. They're agricultural farming communities, very close-knit communities, but very poor. and who actually sacrificed, probably pro rata, the greater number of their children for the war in Syria. I remember speaking to a friend in around 2016, and in a series of villages in Tartus, they'd lost something like 72,000 just from those villages. Can you imagine? And yet now, of course, they're being massacred in their droves. They're being withdrawn from their employment. So most of them now are unemployed. They're being displaced. Their homes are being stolen, and they're being resettled by Takfiri elements, particularly foreign elements, because Jolani promised them this in order to get their loyalty, to fight with him, to make the final push to overthrow Damascus.
Your 72,000, that's roughly the same as what Israel has killed in Gaza, or even more.
It's
actually.
much higher than that. Yeah, I mean, it's way more than that. But yeah.
Well, some analysts actually think that it's in the 200,000.
More, much more now. Like
Because
most of them now are saying around 500,000, to be honest. And
yeah,
I think they're correct. I think they're absolutely correct.
they cannot even estimate it because of all the rubble, basically. But
But hang on, because this is just one very quick point I want to make here. Because they're able to say that in 3 days in Iran, tens of thousands
yeah,
were
yeah, yeah,
killed.
yeah.
But in Gaza, after 2 years of carpet bombing and gassing and chemical weapons and sniping and shelling and bombing by boats in a
Starvation
tiny
and
little
yeah,
enclave,
yeah.
they can't work out if it's 50,000 or 60,000, when in reality, of course, we know it's probably closer to 500,000 because we don't know, as you said, the number of bodies that are still under rubble or have been taken to Israeli prisons also.
But the problem is that in Iran, they're not even, they can't decide whether it's 2,000, 20,000. They can't even decide how many people are going to be hanged. 800,000 or 800. It's just
Well,
bizarre.
I mean, again, that's another very good example because I did a report on the BBC yesterday. There was a protester, Efan Soltani,
Hmm.
and on the BBC report, they said he's about to be executed and there's no appeal. And this went on for 2 weeks. Yesterday, he was released on bail. And what does the BBC report? It says, reportedly, or report says, that Efan Soltani was released on bail. Well, he's there on the streets of Tehran. How can this is how they work. And people need to really understand this, how devious
Did,
Western media is.
did you not see this Israeli girl that she was sitting at home
Oh,
watching the TV
yes.
and she says, I'm
Yeah,
doing
yeah, yeah.
training right now. I'm not dead. I'm not in Iran. I've never been there. I know I'm here.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, and there's a
it's
number of
incredible.
protesters that were claimed to have been killed and who are now saying, no, we're alive, we're fine, like nothing happened. But
Just
we've seen this how many
huge
times?
propaganda.
This is, yeah.
But what I want to say is
Mm,
the narrative is always one-sided. I mean, at the end of the day,
mm,
the Syrian people, what concerns me as a Turkish person is the Syrian people, because we have also a
mm,
lot of Syrians living in Turkey, and it's a huge security problem for me. Uh, what I want to know, for example, in your opinion, and this is something that's been never told, never told in between 2011 and 2024, when eventually Assad left, how many Syrian soldiers, people from from the society that want to defend their own homeland, how many people have actually died protecting
oof, yeah.
homeland?
Personally, I think it's around 500,000. Because I think the numbers that are bandied about of Syrians that died, the majority of those are security forces and Syrian army. They have to be, because who was combating the terrorist forces and hordes that were allowed to enter Syria by the West and by Israel? And Israel was supporting both ISIS and Al Qaeda. Not that personally I see any great difference between
Yeah.
ISIS and Al Qaeda. They're kind of, how to say this, they're an extension of each other. And if you rebrand Al Qaeda as HTS, it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't change the ideology, and the source is pretty much the same. It's the funding is the same, and the competition just comes from a mafia perspective where they're fighting over resources, territory, status, and so on. That's it, and money.
But when you look at it, the recruitment methods are the same, the working methods are the same, the
Yeah, of
ideology is the
course.
same.
Yeah.
I mean, and the finance core is the same. It's just no difference. Now,
No.
I know that we're a little bit tight of time, so I want to ask you. I mean, it's quite obvious that, of course, America has not abandoned the terror organization that it's been supporting for many years, because it's supported it to come to this day, to
Mm.
achieve results basically. Now, you said in the beginning of the program, you mentioned around 400,000 people coming from Lebanon to Syria. I mean, we have to really firstly accept that the people that have lived in Lebanon, for example, when I went to Lebanon as well, I saw the areas that they lived in, and really it was a very, very difficult situation. I mean, these people are not healthy psychologically to start off with. So what does 400,000 Syrians coming from Lebanon mean to Syria and also the region?
Well, first of all, in response to the conditions they're living in, Lebanon is really a failed state. I mean, it's a failed state because since the Taif Agreement, there isn't really a democratic ruling process at all. It's divided into sects. Yeah. Sects have kind of equal power, so no one actually really takes a decision, if that makes sense.
And
then you've had the Ponzi. Then you've had the Ponzi schemes and the Western deliberate destruction of Lebanon's economy because of the existence of the resistance, which has a popular majority in Lebanon. It also has very strong opposition from really the Zionist-aligned phalanges, the Lebanese forces, and so on, right? And then you've had this injection, really, of not all, but many of the refugees in Lebanon were among those that were radicalized in Syria and fled when areas were liberated, particularly in the south, into the camps in Lebanon. And I don't have any evidence, but there is probably strong potential because you have British intelligence working here, you have American intelligence, you have Israeli intelligence, that even within those camps, there were reports, particularly up in Tripoli, that British intelligence were establishing kind of a version of the white helmets and that they were definitely among the camps, indoctrinating and probably radicalizing, right? They were definitely involved in liaison, let's put it that way, with the Syrian refugee camps. There are also, of course, Wahhabis who carried out crimes in Lebanon at the beginning of the war against Syria, whether it was suicide bombings or car bombs and so on, who are in Lebanese prisons, quite rightly, because they were responsible for the massacre of Lebanese people. Now, Jolani is pushing for them to be released, saying that they're, he's not literally saying they're innocent Syrians, but he's saying they're Syrians, send them back to Syria. I remember in 2016, I visited, actually it's the Lebanese forces community in the northeast, Al-Ka. Now, on the border of Al-Ka, inside Lebanon, there was something like 30,000 refugees from Syria at that stage in the war. And I went to Al-Ka days after there was a multiple suicide bombing attack on Al-Ka, where I think, if I remember correctly, there were 4 suicide bombers in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. And it devastated the community. And by the way, Hezbollah went to actually secure the village after this. But again, this isn't talked about. Even though Lebanese forces are in opposition to Hezbollah, Hezbollah went to protect them when the radical elements within the Syrian refugees had attacked their town. And I remember spending the night in the town and going on the roof where the people had formed like a local militia to try and protect their own community. And we could hear the radicals whispering, like literally meters away from the farm where we were sitting. Right. So it was a huge risk for the people in this community, Christian community. And so while not all refugees here in Lebanon are, Jolani affiliated or Jolani aligned, many of them are. And there are probably around 400,000 in total, including the Takfiri that are in prison here or detention. And Jolani wants them all sent back. At the same time, the refugees that went to Europe, also there's a large percentage of Takfiri elements within those refugees because Europe opened its borders to them, right? Because it wanted to create this impression of huge numbers of refugees leaving Syria and it's all Assad's fault. So they opened their borders. Funnily enough, when Jolani came to power and Jolani started massacring Alawites, Druze, driving Christians out of their communities and now Kurds, the borders are closed. No, we're not letting any more Syrian refugees in. The hypocrisy is off the scale. I mean, it's completely criminal. They're condemning people to death and they're introducing the Takfiri elements into their own societies for the future. But now what's happening? Europe, the UK, we know what the US is doing regards deportation, but they're talking about obligatory deportation of Syrian refugees. So what's going to happen? All normal refugees are going to be collectively punished, right? But the Takfiri elements that have created enclaves in places like, I've been there and I've witnessed it, enclaves in places like Sweden, Berlin, huge number in Berlin and in other areas, Belgium, so on. They're all going to be sent back to Syria. I don't know the exact numbers because they're always massaged one way or the other, but you're talking probably potentially 1 million more extremist elements coming back into Syria, which is a scary, scary statistic if you think on the border with Turkey.
Now, there's two things I want to say. Firstly, for years, this is the reason why I went to Syria. For years, they told us, these agents of the West in Turkey operating and spreading the propaganda, that, according to international law, these people cannot go back. This is absolute yes. I mean, when you're talking about your national security, it's your own national law that is valid. Yeah. Okay? And so now I find it really ironic that Germany and the European Union, I mean, this Ursula von der Leyen, I mean, she drives me crazy with her stupidity, is going to, Syria and saying, oh, we need to have these people go back. Why? Why? Because now you're saying that you can send them back, but Turkey cannot. I mean, this double standard is just driving me insane. Because, I mean, anyone that just studies a little bit international law can understand that sovereignty, when it comes down to sovereignty, it's the law of the land that is valid, basically. So, but now we're talking about countries that are, trying to send these people back because, I mean, it's the end of the story. After this, we'll see Europe doing the same to the Ukrainians because they've had enough, I mean, the project is finished, so they want the people back. But it doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
It doesn't work like that.
Ukraine is a bit different because I think Ukraine is actually a major depopulation campaign. I just haven't quite figured out what they need to depopulate it for. There are strong Israeli Zionist roots in Ukraine, so I strongly feel that it's connected somehow to this. But I mean, that's a different subject. Yeah. But for Syria, what they want to do, in my opinion, is to end up with Syria as this kind of horrible Takfiri hub in the region, which can be weaponized. Because in 2015, Jolani, in an interview in Arabic, he basically said, my job is to cut off the hands of the resistance in this region and eventually to cut off the head. And I can do it from inside Iran and I can do it from outside Iran. So if you consider the number of Takfiri that he now has under Washington's and Israel's control with him as a figurehead, right, and meeting Mr. Putin in Moscow and all the rest of it. And we also, I mean, we shouldn't exclude Russia from this process because Russia throughout the war created a relationship with the Kurds because they perceived it as useful for them to maintain their base in Kamishli. Right now, of course, what's happening is they're having to leave Kamishli because Jolani has been weaponized there to release ISIS. and the Russians are leaving. But what happened? They summoned Jolani to Moscow almost immediately, right? And we know that there is a degree, in my opinion, of linkage between Russia, Washington, and Israel. There always actually has been in Syria, particularly between Russia and Israel. And so I don't exclude Russia from this process. I just think, to a degree, it's within that complex of agents that are trying to create this scenario in the Middle East.
Now, we've come to a very good point in that there's a plan to reallocate the Syrian people that have been outside of the country for about 15 years, that have no ideology of being a Syrian anymore. They've been excessively traumatized from what's happening in their own country and considered an outcast in the countries that have hosted them. Basically, they've not been accepted. So now that we have a huge population that will eventually be forced to go back, where they have no jobs, they have no stability, they have no access to healthcare, proper healthcare, no social security, no proper education. So this is like a human nuclear bomb that we are facing in the future.
And look at the geographical location of it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is why I am, as a Turkish person, this topic is so obsessive for me, because I can see it as such a incredible crisis that we will eventually have to face, So it's so important that we insist on getting the correct messages and the truth out. I mean, for me right now, this whole story that Jolani has agreed with YPG and they're going to release all the petrol fields to them. I mean, no one does that immediately. I mean, for me, okay, I'd prefer, of course, the PKK to be finished, but America decides when it's finished, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I mean, I think also what's important to make a point of is in Syria, it's less than 10% of the population, the Kurds, by the way. So how is it powerful enough to form an army that to a degree is capable of withstanding, let's say, ISIS and Jolani to a large degree? Because it's basically been power multiplied by the US. It's been given weapons, training, and reinforcements probably from Turkish PKK and from Kurdistan. And you also have to remember why are the Kurds important from Israel's point of view when you're looking at a war against Iran, when we're talking David's Corridor and you're talking Kurdish enclave in the northeast, and then you're talking joining that Kurdish enclave with the Turkish enclave and the Iraqi enclave. Suddenly you have an entire corridor and an entire border of Iran.
You have a highway.
With the potential. Yeah. And people in Iran told me that many of the rioters were Kurdish separatists. They came in across the border with weapons. And of course, they're being trained to do this. And they were carrying out military exercises, basically, inside Iran. And for me, all of these operations since 2022, like the Masa Amini riots, I went to Tehran just after this, right? And then the 12-day war, the October 2024 assassinations and so on. And then what's just happened. These are all probing exercises to see where the areas of weaknesses are, in my opinion, partly. That is also what is going on. Right, they're testing the defenses, they're testing the ability of Iran to push back. And so far, Iran has actually done a pretty good job of stopping. And what has happened, you've actually achieved the unification of the Iranian people generally, because when it's an external power attacking you, what do the people do? They put aside their differences and they come together to defend their country. And that is exactly what's happened.
With the Masa Amini, I mean, it was a tragic death of a girl, but it was such an obvious CIA operation.
Yeah.
And when I
Well,
said,
she didn't die in captivity. She died in
exactly,
hospital. They took her to hospital.
and she died of a heart attack at the
Yeah.
end of the day.
Yeah.
And she had no physical abuse on her. That's another story.
No, none.
And
Yeah.
what's more important is she went to Tehran with her cousins who were PJAK members. You know, when I was the only person in Turkey to say that this is a CIA operation, you know, and we must be very, very careful with, I mean, with the politicians, of course. And I was, you know, with these, I was literally harassed so much, saying, "Oh no, it's a women's liberation operation," and oh my God.
No, I mean the same for me, because I've been reporting on the latest riots and demonstrating it's all CIA, Mossad run. It's
Exactly.
very clear. It's obvious. The organizations that are producing the statistics are actually based in Langley or Fairfax, Virginia, right next to CIA. Mossad is actually saying, yeah, we did it.
We did it.
Netanyahu is saying, yes, you know, like, I mean, come on, guys, you know, but I'm getting letters from people in like Iranians in the UK who've probably never been to Iran telling me I'm inhumane because I'm saying, you know, like, I'm just like, oh, come on.
Exactly.
Like, honestly.
I mean, it's so obvious sometimes. I mean, to me, Iran is as important as Syria because it's the second longest border that we share. After Syria. So,
and instability in Iran.
yes,
Look, imagine if Iran were to fall. What happens? You then have, let's say, 1 million Takfiri in Syria, which can happily then enter the borders of Iran. Iran then becomes like the whole, if we go back to this idea of Karbala, right? This dominance of, GCC bloc from an economic perspective, but also from an ideological perspective. That's terrifying. For me, that's terrifying because that affects the whole world. And particularly Turkey, because Turkey is literally bang center in the middle of all of this. So is Russia, by the way. I don't think Russia is, in my opinion, seeing the threat right now because they are so secure, in a sense, in their relationship with Israel and now with Trump. I mean, what are we seeing? We're seeing Russian policy literally pivoting towards Trump right now in what's the word? Opposition to the EU and the UK. This is becoming very, very clear now.
Yeah, but we saw it in the national security strategy that he outlined. I mean, he didn't have anything to say about
Trump.
Russia. Yeah. He was very clear that now Russia is an ally and Europe is the, you know.
But to a degree, they always have been. Remember in 2018 when John Kerry was under the Obama administration, he was drawing the US much closer to Russia in Syria in the war against ISIS.
But they need each other because I mean, something that people don't really realize is wars actually are a very, very good opportunity to develop the military field, technology. So they need wars. I mean, Russia needs such a war and America needs such a war, and also China not getting involved, but also providing equipment. They have a huge test field at the cost of people's lives. I mean, for example, the Ukrainian war, America openly admits this. The Ukrainian war was the first space war that they tested on the field. I mean, this is so unbelievable, but it's reality. So we have to also understand that the way the wars are being fought now have changed.
Yeah,
so that's why.
But also, even for China, because you mentioned China's not getting involved militarily, but it's providing the weapons that the UAE is using to commit genocide through the RSF in Sudan, for example. It's providing drones and surveillance technology to the Zionists to identify and kill people in Gaza. Yeah, and from a perspective of China, it has what, 90% monopoly of rare earth mineral mining and processing, in which case it's destroying the environment, to be honest, globally. But at the same time, those REMs are necessary to make the weapons that other countries are profiting from, right? So of course, everyone's enmeshed in the war economy. That's the point. And you know, it goes beyond that. I think if you look at the recently released from 2001 onwards, so from 9/11 onwards, the recently released conversations between George W. Bush and Putin, it becomes very clear. And I don't think Putin's general tendency to pivot to the West has changed, to be honest. He talks in one conversation in 2001 that this isn't, I think it was after 9/11, maybe 2003. And he's talking about, to Bush, he says, you know, this isn't really about terrorists and all of this. It's about Jewish capital versus Islamic capital. He literally says it. And then it becomes very clear that really the majority of people are going to align with Jewish capital or Zionist capital, because that is what is driving the global economy, the global capitalist economy, right? So it makes absolute sense in very simplistic terms that Putin is going to want to stay in that camp because he sees that as the dominant economic camp.
Even like the United Arab Emirates.
Yeah, I don't consider them countries, you know that.
Residing with the Jewish side.
Yeah. Well, they were also created by the British to do so. I mean, you know, Saudi Arabia in particular, but by default, Qatar and UAE were kind of created at the same time as the Zionist entity was created in order to provide protection and apologism, hence the Abraham Accords, and we now have the Isaac Accords in Latin America, to bring everyone under the kind of dominance of Israel or Israeli supremacy, Zionist supremacy, more like in the region, right? So they were created for this role, but they're doing it extremely well.
Well, they've done their homework. Now, we've come to the end of the program, but just one small question I want to ask you. Now, you know that the whole world is like going upside down with the Epstein files. And
it's all I see on social media. I opened X just before I came on. I was like, oh my God.
But war also creates an incredible void of people going missing and getting lost, etc. I mean, you cannot follow people there. Do you believe that with the Syrian war, because I know there's a case where there's missing 10,000 children that's gone to Germany. Do you think that Syrian children have been part of the smuggling route with the Epstein situation?
Yes, I mean, I don't have any serious documentation. It was something that I was really investigating during my time in Syria, because the White Helmets, of course, were one of those channels through which these children were being extricated. If you remember the bombing in Rashidin in 2017 in southern Aleppo, when thousands of refugees from Nubal and Zara were bombed by a suicide truck. The wounded, dead, dying, still alive children were piled up in the back of Nusra Front trucks, actually. Some were returned, but not the majority. I think there's still around 50 missing. This is just one operation. Now, either the recently dead bodies were taken for organ extraction, because, of course, you know that you only have 72 hours that the organs are still viable. Children or teenage organs are the most viable. And, you know, this is the red harvest or the red market, as it's known, is one of the biggest harvests from war. And then the child trafficking, which has been, you know, a regular occurrence in Ukraine, for example. So during the war in Ukraine, of course, this has been something that has been ongoing even more and has been reported upon. But the White Helmets were accused of this, of child abduction, even when Jolani took power and he was massacring people on the coastal areas. The White Helmets were reported to have been there cleaning up and taking the bodies and the injured and taking them out of Syria. So in my opinion, it's not something that has been heavily documented. There was one Russian organization that did investigate it from around 2016 onwards, Maxim Grigoriev. I think it's I've completely forgotten the name of the organization, but if you look up Maxim Grigoriev, you can find his reports. And I was actually part of a panel at the UN back in 2017 covering the organ theft and the child abduction. And, you know, if you look at the fraudulent chemical weapon attacks, it was children that were literally killed for those attacks to be produced as theater. There are multiple cases of children that were taken from one area and then suddenly appeared in these kind of snuff videos that were supposed to have been chemical weapon attacks, even shown at the UN, which to me is, you know, this is just the depth of depravity that you can actually watch an instrument of the West, which is the white helmet. Apparently, there were Swedish doctors for human rights that investigated these videos and said that the medical procedures carried out on these children would have killed them if they were not already dead. And yet these procedures were filmed and shown in the UN. So for me, what's happening now, we're just discovering that everything that we've been talking about, or certainly I was talking about that was going on in Syria, is only a tiny percentage of what they're actually capable of doing. That's the point that I take away from this. Suddenly, everything that we've been accusing Israel and the West of doing, and people have laughed at us and said, you're just conspiracy theorists, you're crazy, you know, no one talks about this stuff, it's not happening in our society. Hello? It's not only happening, it's like a million times worse. And it's infected every single sector of society, from the police to justice to government to health to, it doesn't matter, you know? So yes, I don't have any numbers because it's something, in a sense, in Syria in particular, I did speak to one head of forensics in Damascus, and he was quite open about it, but he said it's so difficult to investigate. And he was literally waiting for Idlib to be liberated so he could get in and continue his investigations. And then what happens? Jolani takes power and all of that evidence, all of that information is lost. So it's something that goes very underground very quickly. And you'd probably, I think, any research would have to be done on the dark web. And then, you know, you're opening yourself up to all sorts of elements that are not necessarily going to be very healthy for you or for me long term.
Yeah. Well, thank you very, very much, Vanessa. As always, it's been incredible talking to you.
No, you're welcome.
It's very depressing, actually. It's very depressing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
It's very hard, but we have to keep, you know, I think information is key, because information, even, you know, the thing is that everything evolves. The situation evolves on an almost hourly basis right now. So what you and I are discussing today may well suddenly be turned on its head tomorrow because something else has been brought into the equation. And geopolitics is not stagnant or static anyway. I think people need to remember this. But I think information is key for an individual to understand what's going on and to take measures to protect themselves. That's how I look at it. That's how I personally look at it. I don't get depressed, even though sometimes it's very difficult, because for me, clarity is liberation. Clarity is empowerment for me, because I can understand then the way forward. I can understand how to deal with the situation. What the media does in the West is to obfuscate that reality, so that you're constantly in this either sense of false security or a sense of limbo where you're not actually sure where things are going to end up. And so you can't react accordingly. So thank you, because, you know, you're one of the few people that are able to have these discussions. And even though we might disagree on some aspects, ultimately we're heading in the same direction, which is to protect humanity, really, from the powers that are trying to destroy it.
Thank you very much.